This is Media Sales Mastery, the podcast for media sales professionals. In each episode, we bring you information, insights, ideas, and interviews from some of the industry's top thought leaders. Head to mediasalesmastery.com to help pick the topic and guide the show.
This is Media Sales Mastery, the podcast for media sales professionals. I'm your host, Jamie Wood, and our topic today is getting the most out of your sales leader. So when preparing for this season of the podcast, I took another, I'm going to say informal survey from several people in the industry. Sales leadership was one of the most requested topics that we cover. Things like, what does a sales manager actually do? Is sales management for me? How do I better understand what my sales manager wants from me? But interestingly, we also had several sales managers reach out, and they wanted to gain a better understanding of what their salespeople wanted from them. So clearly, there is a need for better dialogue between salespeople and sales managers. You know, perhaps we've contributed to this issue. This very podcast, we have a segment called I Can't Ask My Sales Manager That. But we've got a guest today. Our guest is Cameron Plant. Cam is a senior media business leader. He's currently based in Dubai and has extensive experience across multiple continents. He's worked as a sales director, as a national sales operations director, as a COO, as a CEO, and as an international media business consultant. So we're really looking forward to having Cam on the show to discuss all things sales leadership. Cameron, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jamie. Good to be here.
Mate, I first of all have to apologise for waking you up at an ungodly hour over there in the morning in Dubai. Thanks for joining us and being part of the show, mate. We've known each other a while now. I think you had just moved from Asia back to Dubai when we first met. You're obviously over there now. The topic we're covering off is all around sales leadership today, and I thought let's kick it off with just hearing a bit more about yourself, where you obviously started in media and your career to date.
The first five.
Yeah, it's 1:30 in the morning here, so you'll have to excuse my voice a bit. But, yeah, look, I started in regional TV and, I had a regional sales background. So I started at Win in Rockhampton and got transferred around and ultimately ended up in radio in Melbourne and worked for Austereo for about 10 years. And Greg Worthington and I then took on a consultancy sort of role or business, and we ended up, travelling around the world, and it was fantastic. It was really good. So been exposed to lots of different cultures, different languages, different businesses, and it's been a nice ride, been a good journey.
It's been really, one thing I've really enjoyed about this podcast is that we do get to speak to people like yourself who aren't just based in Australia. They've had sort of global experience. And what I find really interesting is whenever we talk to somebody from overseas, they really kind of reinforce that media sales, fundamentally the brilliant basics of media sales are applicable really in any market you go to. Granted, there's different nuances. A frontier market's different from a developed market. But I was really interested to have a chat to you specifically about sales leadership around the world and sales management around the world, because when we initially created this podcast, it was for people in those initial 5 years of media sales where it's a difficult career path to navigate. And what really sort of has been coming through to me is that there does feel like there's a bit of a disconnect in an understanding of what a sales manager actually does. So I'm curious to hear, has that been your experience? What was your experience early on with sales managers, and what was your perception coming up through the ranks?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Two things don't change no matter where I've been. And first is radio stations want to make more money, and media companies generally want to make more money. And clients are after more value. And irrespective of where I've been, those things don't change. There is always a disconnect, I think, between a salesperson and sales manager. And I think the skills required to do both jobs, albeit on the surface might look similar, but they are actually quite different. Salespeople can get away with being selfish, and sales managers and sales directors have to be selfless. And I think that's the major difference, and I think that's what causes the disconnect between the two.
That's a really, really good point. It's funny, I've been a sales director now for 6+ years and leading sales teams for about 7 years. And selfishness in a salesperson is actually a really good attribute for them to have many times, because you want them to be focused on driving their revenue, achieving their budget, contributing to the goal of the team, obviously, but making sure that they do have that single-minded focus on achieving the goal.
Media Sales Mastery.
Let's jump into this main topic because I think we want to just cover off some of the foundational, questions that people might have. Like, in your view, Cameron, what is sales leadership and what does it actually involve at a day-to-day level?
It's not a simple question to answer. First and foremost, I think it's a people role. And I think sales managers and sales directors need to understand that they're a resource to the team and that ultimately they're accountable to the team, not round the other way. External clients and internal clients and managing up the line is sometimes as important as leading the team as well. So it's important to understand that while you might have been selfish as a salesperson, as a sales manager or as a sales director, that's just not going to fly. How many times do salespeople walk into an office and think, oh, I wonder if the boss is in a good mood and, all those things. So there needs to be a consistency of emotion, a consistency of mood. And the sales manager or that leader of that team needs to be able to instill reliability and trust and overall accountability to the team. I also think there's a level of, obviously KPI measurement and revenue forecasting and all those sorts of things. But ultimately, they are there, sales managers are there for their team. And I think, if you're a first-time sales manager and you've walked in and you're managing a team, the hard part is to make the jump between being that sales guy where your time's your own, you can do whatever you want, pretty much, to going, actually, I've got 4, 6, 8, 10 people that I'm now responsible for. And the temptation can be to KPI them into the concrete, micromanage them, and make it hard for them, when what they should be doing is empowering and trusting them to do the job that they're employed to do. And I think it requires a different mindset.
It sounds to me like there is a little bit of a reframe that needs to occur, because you're absolutely right. In a typical hierarchy, you do think of your manager as your boss. And I do think in the context of media sales, you're absolutely right, Cameron, that you do need to view your manager as a coach, as a resource, as a support. There is definitely that fine balance between setting direction, setting KPIs, keeping people accountable, but that can very quickly turn into micromanagement. And you're absolutely correct. It's a much more nuanced role in sales than potentially a role like, and look, not having any issue with finance, but if you think about finance, there's a level of, I suppose, more consistency to how they typically would run their department through a month and what the critical duties are. Sales is very much based on, I believe, giving people the tools and support to then be able to go and enable them to do what they need to do. One of the questions that I think is fairly common and I really grappled with early on, it's a real simple follow-on from your first answer. What's the difference between a sales manager and a sales director?
I suppose the major difference here is that the sales manager role is still an operational role. It's a day-to-day type role. And, a sales manager, you're still going out seeing clients. You are dealing with, internal politics. You're thinking about, how do I get budget this month? How do I get budget for the quarter? How do I motivate this particular salesperson who looks like they're going to miss their target? So they're more worried about the day-to-day things. The sales director, I think, has a more strategic type role. They're thinking ahead more. They're thinking to themselves, okay, what do I want this business to look like in 12 months' time? How do I get there? What are the overall business goals that my GM has shared with me or that the business has shared with me? What resources do I need to get there in 12 months? How does my team look? Are the team that I currently have capable of taking the business to where it needs to go in 12 months' time? Are there people here on the bus that I don't want on the bus next year? if that's the case, what kind of people do I need on the bus? And maybe there's people within the team who are sitting in a particular seat on the bus that need to change seats. So they've got more of an umbrella view about what the business requires, and they're not necessarily in the day-to-day like the sales manager would be.
That's a really, really good definition or between both of the roles and the delineation of their duties there. I think when you and I were chatting about this particular topic, one thing that you mentioned to me was early on in your career in coming up in media, you didn't actually really have an understanding of what your sales manager was doing a lot of the time. I mean, you'd have your weekly whip, but then it would seem like you didn't necessarily have a full view on what they would be filling their, the other 35 hours of their week with. Why do you think that is the case, Cameron? Why is it that so many salespeople don't fully comprehend or have a limited understanding of what a sales manager's role looks like day to day?
Yeah, well, Jamie, for some sales guys, it's not their job to try and understand it. Their job is to go out, service their client, understand the client's needs, and go back with solutions that satisfy them and get the result. Now, there's some sales guys who are interested in what the sales manager role is, and it's probably due to the fact that they potentially want to be a sales manager down the track, or they have some ambition to move up the ladder. But there are some sales guys who frankly don't care. They look at the sales manager and think, I don't care what you're doing. All I need to do is hit budget every month. So I think it's up to the sales manager sometimes to impart what he or she does, and I think there are other times where you don't necessarily need to do that. If you've got a person in your team that you believe has the potential to be a sales manager down the track, then you might share things with that salesperson about how you go about setting a target for a team and an individual salesperson. You might talk to them about individual development plans that you might have in place for those people. So you'll give them some kind of an insight into what the sales manager's role is. But I don't think every single person in that team necessarily needs to know exactly what that sales manager is doing or what that role is. And as I say, there are many people who actually don't want to know either.
I think it's also probably interesting to note that media sales, just by its very nature, it's a high-pressure occupation, and there's a very specific, I'm not going to say personality type, but there are certain personal attributes that form the basis of a good media salesperson. Often people like to work autonomously, they like to be entrepreneurial, they are self-starters, if you will, they're self-motivating. But, and I obviously have sales managers reporting into me, I do have to set the expectation that the sales managers need to keep these salespeople highly accountable for certain activities, specifically revenue performance. And I suppose I'm curious, Cam, in that dynamic where you've got somewhat these two opposing forces of this person who's very self-reliant, self-starting, and then a sales manager who does need to put structure and framework around how this person actually structures their week and delivers those activities. You mentioned micromanagement can be very dangerous. What are some of the other ensuing issues that can occur in this manager-salesperson relationship?
You are going to win a salesperson over through their heart and mind, not through their pocket. So you have to get to know them. You have to understand them. Work out what makes them tick. Work out what it is that drives that salesperson. Sometimes it can be purely money. Sometimes it can be they want a career, they want to get into a leadership position. There's a whole different, so I remember one sales guy, all he wanted to do was earn enough money so he could renovate his house. That was his main goal. He didn't care about anything else. But you have to find those things out. Otherwise, you may as well give up.
It's a really, really good point. And I think some of the best sales leaders that I've worked underneath have been very good at finding that natural balance between going, what are Jamie's unique drivers? What are his motivations? Yep. What actually compels him to perform? But then very good at also being able to align those drivers to the objectives of the business. And that is a real art and a skill set in itself, because it can be very easy to sit there and as a sales leader go, these are the objectives of the business and we need everybody to rally around this because these metrics are important to the business. And it's like you've actually got people here that are, very much different individuals,
Yeah.
often you have a group of 10 to 15 salespeople, they might have completely different aspirations, motivations, drivers from each other. And yet being able to pull them towards a common goal together and be able to achieve the objectives of the business, that to me is really the art of sales management and sales leadership, where I can see people really thrive in the profession or really miss the mark.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And, some salespeople actually don't care what the objectives of the business are. They're not there for that. They're there to earn as much money as they can and do it as quickly as possible. And sometimes that doesn't align to the business, which can be a problem. And it comes back to the employment of people as well. When you're talking about things like that, it's like when you're speaking to someone and you're looking to fill a role, you're trying to work out not necessarily whether they've got the skill to do the role. What you're trying to work out is, are they a good cultural fit? Are they going to come on board with what the business requires? And, I look at job ads for salespeople, particularly in media roles, and it says things like they must be proficient at PowerPoint, they must be expert at Excel. And I think, why? Why do they need to be expert at those things? What they need to be expert at is communicating externally to a client to understand the client's needs. They need to communicate expertly internally to ensure that when they're creating a campaign, whether it's an integrated campaign or whether it's a straight buy, that people internally are going to help them execute that campaign. Those are the key factors for me. It's not whether the guy's good at Word or PowerPoint or Excel. I'm always amazed when I see that.
I am too, and I mean, I think I would say what's interesting. My experience with my team, predominantly selling into the agency market, is that you do have some fairly sophisticated technical skills with some of these agency salespeople. They're great. They're great strategically. They can build a beautiful deck. They can build a really great schedule. But what underpins that skill set is really high EQ, really, really good stakeholder management, and a real orientation towards the client. Where the sales manager kind of comes into that is very much being able to provide the tools, the support. And I think what you said before around that internal stakeholder management and being able to articulate client objectives internally, that's where I've really seen sales managers lend, some very strong support, is being able to go, are our systems, processes, structures, internal relationships, are they the best they can possibly be? Are they aligned to the market? And are they enabling our salespeople to be successful?
Yep.
What I wanted to ask, which was a bit of a follow-on from what we were talking about earlier, is, you're right, it's not the salesperson's job to understand what the sales manager needs to do. The salesperson needs to very much focus on driving their revenue objectives, hitting their targets. But how does a media salesperson listening to this that might have let's say, a strained relationship with their sales manager, or a relationship that doesn't really feel like it's quite in that sweet spot of feeling like this person is really delivering them value, how could a salesperson achieve the best outcome and extract the maximum amount of value from their sales manager?
Look, I think the first thing that the salesperson can do is they need to be proactive. So they have to manage their manager, and they've got to manage their manager's expectations. They need to communicate really clearly with their manager about what their own personal goals are, and take them on sales calls. Even the experienced guys, like if you've been selling for 10 years and you've been around the block and you know your clients, 100% and you're writing good money, that's fine. But I'd still take my sales manager out and say to him or her after the call, can we just have 15 minutes? Is there something I missed? Is there some way that I can improve? Utilise them as a resource and don't view them as I'm taking the boss to a client. Help them, get them to help you close the deal as well. And ultimately that salesperson needs to live the values of the business that they're in. So that the sales manager then looks at the salesperson and goes, I trust this salesperson. I don't need to spend so much time with this guy. my time could be spent better with this other person over here who needs more development. So it's about managing up the line by that salesperson to the manager and having very clear expectations about what each is providing each other.
I think that's a really good insight there, Cam. You know, one of the things in my experience has always been, and you know, I think it's sort of counterintuitive because some people go, I don't want to feel high maintenance. I don't want to feel like I'm coming in and putting all these demands on my sales director or my sales manager. Oftentimes it's the salespeople that actually do really push for what they require and really push for you know, the sales leader to give them tools and support, to spend time in their office to table ideas. They're the ones that you actually really enjoy working with. You know, they're the people that feel like they're hyper engaged in their role. And I would completely agree that the people in my experience that have often got the best results out of me are the ones that can really come and hold me accountable to providing tools, support, guidance, feedback, wherever it is that they feel it's going to add value. And I suppose for the people listening here, really, we do need to look at this like you're running your own business, and there are certain resources that you have when you're doing that. Your sales manager and your sales leader is absolutely one of those very vital resources that you should be tapping into, but make a point of actually thinking what a structured approach would look like when you do that. Where do you feel you need more feedback or guidance? Where do you feel like potentially you need them to loosen the reins? What's some of the things that you think over the next 12 months you could integrate into your dialogue with your sales leader so that you could build some capability and competence? I think it's really, you know, not to say the onus is on everybody, but in my experience, you know, the reps who really just take that initiative and really drive what they require from their sales leader often get the best results.
No, that's true. And, you know, sometimes the highest maintenance reps are the ones that deliver you the best result. And when you're managing them, it's a balance, right? So you're trying to balance the amount of time that you spend with someone to the type of return that you get from that person. And sometimes that balance is it's hard to get perfect.
You're absolutely right.
What you're trying to do is you're trying to maximise the opportunity that salesperson has to maximise their own revenue and then consequently revenue for the business. And as I say, you probably never get it right. You probably never get the balance right. But if you are at least aware of what the goal is to try and get that balance right, then that's half the battle. If you find yourself as a sales manager spending time with the salesperson where you're spending way too much time and not getting a result, or you're not seeing improvement, then maybe you don't need that salesperson on the bus anymore. Maybe your time is better off spent with someone else who is going to increase their revenue and who is going to improve the performance of the overall business. So, you know, as I say, it's a difficult balance to get.
No, and it's a reality of what we do, because I think you've raised a good point. And you know, for the people listening that are maybe in a sales management role, this really does apply to you. You do need to think strategically around how you allocate your time. At the end of the day, the job of a sales leader is to put time, people, and money into the areas that are going to generate the best possible return for the business. Now, that can sometimes feel at odds with what you naturally want to do as a leader, which is, I'm going to devote a lot of time coaching this particular rep who is struggling and get them up to being competent. You do need to have that internal dialogue with yourself to go, if the filter is that we need to generate the maximum return, is my time better spent supporting my top performing salespeople and the ones that are actually able to generate high returns to the business?
Yep.
Look, bit of a moral quandary that I think people struggle with. There's no right answer, as you say, Cam, but you raise a good point around time allocation there in that sales management role.
Yep.
Let's talk a little bit about people who might have aspirations to move into sales management. So, you know, for people that are really enjoying the media sales gig, but feel like they want to move into a sales management style position in the next few years.
Yep.
I mean, what advice would you have for those people who have an aspiration to move into sales leadership? What would be some of the things that they could potentially start to develop and work on now?
It's a really good question. I can tell you, year one, they're probably going to earn less than what they earned as a rep. And they need to get their head around that, right? Because they've probably been really successful and they're probably making really good money. Their clients love them. And all of a sudden they look at the retainer as a sales manager and look at the commission structure and it's probably not as good. So they need to get their head around it. Second thing, and we talked about it earlier, they need to be selfless. So they need to bridge the gap between being potentially selfish as a rep and become selfless. Also, sometimes, depending on the size of the team or the size of the business, sales managers end up managing potentially people who actually aren't in sales. So they might manage creative people or production people or sales coordinators or traffic managers and so on. So they need to understand that their job as a sales manager is not just managing salespeople, it's managing a group of other people.
Really good point.
Whose motivations are completely different, potentially, from a salesperson. And then I think if you're a first-time sales manager, have a written plan that you and your sales director have agreed on, an operational plan. And maybe it's, the first 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, something like that. You sit down and you work out the plan with the sales director and then you execute. So he or she knows what you're doing and you know what you're doing. And you're not guessing about, should I do this or should I do that, or should I go with this rep, or should I take him out for a coffee, or, everything's sort of planned out and agreed with your boss. The other thing that I think might help is, and there are teams where I've done this, is you meet each person one-on-one in your team for 30 minutes, maybe an hour, take them out for coffee and you ask them a couple of questions. And those questions might be, what do you want from me? How can I help you? And what's the biggest challenge that you face right now? And once you ask those 2 or 3 questions, the person will generally open up and say, well, actually, I think my budget's too high, or I want to be a manager down the track like you've just become, or I'm having trouble with this client, or whatever. I think there's a tendency for first-time sales managers to say to a salesperson, I want you to do this, and then this is your KPI, and I need you to hit budget. And it's actually not about that. It's about finding out from the salesperson what they need from you. Just as a salesperson, when you see a client, you're saying to them, how can I help? Tell me about your business. You're doing this uncovery on the client. Similarly, the sales manager needs to do the uncovery on the salesperson. And I think the other thing too, from a sales manager perspective, is all of a sudden you've got to manage up the line and down the line. As a sales rep, you don't necessarily have to do that. So you find yourself, you are now the meat in the sandwich. And a lot of guys struggle with that. They might know how to manage up the line to the sales director, but they don't necessarily know how they should manage their team, or vice versa. So try and add value, or at least create value at the outset for that salesperson and for that team. And don't tell them what you want, ask them what you can give. I think that's really important.
I would wholeheartedly agree with that, Cameron. I think, and I've changed markets a few times. I've changed teams a few times as a sales leader. Or what I would say, learning from some big missteps I made early in my career, one of them is exactly what you said there, is you need to go in with an approach of how do I actually build emotional equity with these people? How do I show them that I'm here to support them? I've got their back. I want to understand what's important to them, how they can feel like I'm delivering value. Yep. Only once you've done that, you've gained their trust, you've gained their respect, you've got a few runs on the board, for want of a better term, then you can actually start to hold them more accountable. And I think that is a big misstep that you see a lot of sales leaders make. And you're right. There's a delicate balance to internal stakeholder management. That's a whole new world for a lot of sales leaders. And I can tell you, I love the approach of being in the middle there and having to balance those two things. But it's something that's really, for a lot of people that haven't had that exposure, it's a big part of your role and your world, internal stakeholder management and managing up the line as a sales leader.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're better off trying to win their heart and mind than trying to win them through their pocket. So I remember when I was sales director, sales managers would come to me and say, here are the budgets that I've allocated my team for the next quarter. What do you think? And after a while, you knew pretty much straight away who the sales manager was giving a soft budget to and who they were giving a hard budget to. And I'd always look at that and say, are you trying to win this salesperson that you're giving a soft budget to? Are you trying to win them over? Or is there some reason why you're giving them a soft budget? And oftentimes it was because, and generally they'd be the experienced salespeople. Oftentimes it was, I don't want to upset him because, he's a really high performer and blah, 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 and this person needs to improve over here. So, so it comes down to even that budgeting process can impact your ability to lead the team effectively to get the right business result,
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that can't be understated. The ability to calibrate different drivers, around a budgetary level and, and making sure that you are. I mean, that is the other thing that we could probably do a whole episode on is that line between, having a personal relationship with these people versus, still being able to separate yourself from the emotion, from the person and think strategically about how you actually run your team.
Yeah.
Which actually leads me to the final segment I want to jump into, Cameron.
I can't ask my sales manager that.
Ironically, and I mentioned this at the top of the podcast, I'm like, we've got a segment here called I Can't Ask My Sales Manager That. And the whole reason this was created was because when the podcast was actually first built, I did a massive survey via SurveyMonkey. And one of the questions was, look, what's a question you don't feel comfortable asking your boss? Either because it's an interesting dynamic that you think is, maybe might upset them. Maybe it's an interpersonal issue you've got that you don't want to reveal to your manager. So I can't help but feel like we're contributing to the problem here. But I want to throw you a question that a listener has submitted, and then I thought you and I could just kind of unpack it in real time and see if we can uncover what's going on here. So
sure.
The question is from Alicia. She works in a very specific area of activations and event sales, but very much in that media space. So here it is. I have a new boss who was recently promoted from the same job as me into a sales manager position. He's a very strong personality and was a very successful salesperson in our company. I really like him personally, but I also struggle reporting into him compared to his predecessor, who had a much more hands-off approach to coaching and supporting. He is very friendly, but spends a lot of time giving me feedback around small elements of my approach, often making minor changes to my proposals and emails, and even after overhearing a phone call I've made, he gives me thoughts and feedback. Now, I know it's an adjustment, but it's been 5 months. I don't think he has fully stepped away from the salesperson mindset. I really want to make this relationship work, but right now I'm struggling with both the dynamic and with my results. He really isn't acting like a sales manager, but I don't want him to think it's sour grapes or me making excuses for my poor results. What makes it a bit harder is our general manager and he are really close, so I don't want to go over his head. How do I get him to see from my perspective? First of all, and the one thing I would say is this question came up a lot more than just from this one person, Alicia, but I thought she really brilliantly articulated the issue that often arises with a first-time sales manager. What's your initial impression of that, Cameron? What do you think's going on there?
Well, firstly, she's shown an enormous amount of courage to ask the question.
Yeah.
And, hats off to her for that. I think, we could discuss this for an hour, I reckon. But ultimately, she needs to consider a couple of things. Firstly, the challenge for her sales manager is twofold. Firstly, he's got to try and prove to his GM, even though he might be mates with him and friends and whatever, but there's still an element of he's got to prove to his GM that he's picked the right guy. So that's the first thing. The second thing is he's also trying to prove to the team that he came from that they've picked the right guy, right? So he's trying to please two parties, one up the line and a party down the line. And it takes courage to sort of trust in a team at the start when you feel like you need to prove yourself both up the line and down the line. He's got to, like we mentioned before, he's got to go from selfish to selfless. And there is a tendency for first-time sales managers to micromanage. They can KPI people into the concrete sometimes. And the problem with that is the salesperson starts thinking about their KPIs more than they're thinking about their clients' needs. and it actually takes their eye off the ball. So the sales manager's thinking, oh, if I improve this area here and I generate X amount of new business there and we do X amount of sales calls here and whatever the KPIs are, if he's purely focused on that and not the people side, then he'll fail. And what he needs to think about is to be a resource to the team, not be their boss. So I think there's 3 things Alicia can do, and anyone out there for that matter, if they're confronted with the same issue, is I'd do this. I'd take him out on sales calls each week. I'd do 3 to 5 of them, and then ask for feedback after each meeting. The second thing I'd do is organise a weekly work in progress meeting where there's an agreed agenda and you sit down and you discuss development, progress, achievement to budget, any client issues that they've got, so on. And then the third is agree on weekly or monthly KPIs and then report your performance of those KPIs proactively to him. Don't wait for him to ask you for the report. Go to him with it. And ultimately what you're doing there is trying to build trust with him. And it's likely then that he won't micromanage you anymore and he'll move on to someone else. But it's a great question that Alicia's asked. It's a really good question. And particularly when a guy is promoted from within the team to then lead a team that he was a part of, it's actually, I mean, that guy's got a difficult job and she needs to understand that as well. It's actually a hard task. It's not like a guy's been brought in from the outside, I'm the new guy, I'm the new, sales manager, whatever. It's not like that. He's actually probably under more pressure than what she realises.
I think that's a really good point. And what I would actually say is she's shown a great deal of emotional intelligence here and just kind of uncovering what she thinks at play. And in terms of, he's obviously new, he's eager to get runs on the board. It's a big step up for him. He's dealing with the situation the best that he knows how to, which is defaulting to his tried and true sales skills and his playbook, which obviously was very successful for him. Yep. But I think what you've said there is a really, really strong approach around taking the emotion out, putting structure in, building trust, and being empathetic to the fact that this is a big transition. I think those are really, really good takeaway points, Cameron. And best of luck to you, Alicia. And this is probably where we want to wrap this up, mate, because I think we could talk a lot about a lot of different topics. I know you've had a lot of experience. I wanted to know, just on the topic of sales management, sales leadership, was there any sort of parting thought that you had for everybody listening at home?
I think the job is about people. You've got to get a result for the business, no question about that. And you've got to live the core values of the business that you're working within. There's no question about that either. But the job is a people job. It's not a sales job, whether it's you're leading people in a team or whether you're dealing with a client. I'd like $1 for every time I've seen a salesperson go out and see a client and present some deck to them about what the radio station is or what the television station is or what the newspaper out there. It's a matter of making that personal connection with that client or that internal stakeholder and getting to understand what drives that person and building trust. And if you do that, that's half the battle. I remember times where you might, give a budget to a salesperson, you're sitting down with them and they say, oh, gee, you've given me a really high budget. I don't know whether I can get, say it was 100,000 for the month. I don't think I can get that. It's like, well, how much money have you written so far, and what do you think you'll write with your eyes closed and your hands tied behind your back? Well, I think I'll get 50 or 60. Okay, so your budget's not 100. Your budget is the gap between what you know you're going to write and what your budget is. Work on that. So it's about bringing it back to the basics, and the basics mean that you need to understand what drives that person. And the only way you can understand what drives that person is to get to know that person and ask them questions about themselves, which means that it comes back to we're in a people business.
I think that is a really, really, really good summary, Cameron. I would wholeheartedly agree. I have not a single thought to add to that at all, mate. Other than to say, thank you for being so generous with your time. You know, I'm pretty passionate about this podcast for a couple of reasons. One, because I think that it's really serving a need for people who are navigating a very difficult initial couple of years in what is a very competitive and very cutthroat industry, but also that I get to talk to people like yourself who've had, you know, such a great breadth of experience. The final thing I wanted to ask is, you know, if anyone in the audience would be able to reach out to you with questions, where might be the best place for them to contact you? Yep,
they can through LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn, or mate, if they want to contact you, that's fine as well. But probably LinkedIn first up.
Fantastic. Well, what I'll do is I'll put a link to your contact details in the show notes of this episode. Guys, feel free to reach out to Cameron. I can vouch for him. He's a very sharp operator. Make sure that when you call him, you try not to call him where it's 1:30 a.m. in Dubai. Try to schedule your calendar a little bit better. But Cameron, I just want to say a very sincere thank you, mate, for setting that alarm clock and making yourself available to have a chat today, mate. It's much appreciated.
Honestly, it's my pleasure, mate, and I'm happy to help.
You've been listening to Media Sales Mastery, the podcast for media sales professionals. Head to mediasalesmastery.com to help pick the topic, guide the show, and don't forget to subscribe to receive new episodes each week.